This session, I think, was a really important one to include in the program of SHJ at 50. We could have called it, How Did the Experiment Turn Out? Now, we are not up here representing all of the children who grew up in humanistic Jewish communities across North America. We are representing our own experiences. And this is what they call today qualitative research, where you look at a few specific cases and examine them in depth. If you want statistics, you can get those in other ways. I think that the stories that we'll share today will be useful, not only to look back on what we've done, but to look forward into how we can change moving on. My first job in humanistic Judaism was in 1993, the summer after I graduated high school, as an unpaid intern in the office. So I've been the young one at movement events for a long time. I'm very excited to be able to get out of the way this morning and ask people younger than myself, who also grew up in humanistic Judaism, to share their experiences and insights. Now, our speakers have bios in the program book, and I trust you know how to read and you can read those. But I do want to highlight some of the diversity represented on this panel. As I said, I grew up at the Birmingham Temple and also worked here early in my career. Kira Appelman grew up at Machar, the Washington Congregation for Secular Humanistic Judaism in the DC area. Eva Cohen grew up at Oramet, the Minnesota Congregation for Humanistic Judaism. And Libby Otto grew up at the Secular Jewish Circle of Puget Sound in the Seattle area. So together we represent different urban areas, multiple time zones, and different regions of the country. And also different congregational styles, from the most formal and established with a building to much more informal. So hopefully over the next hour we will both agree and disagree. I do want to say as one caveat before we start, I really appreciate the opportunity for us to share our thoughts, because it's very rare that children get to evaluate their parents. So please take any criticism with love. My first question to ask our panel is, what were some of the positives of your experience growing up in humanistic Judaism? Anyone?
Does the mic work like this? Oh, I can hear myself. Well, thank you for having us on this panel. This is very exciting. I've never been on a panel before. Some of the positives that I feel are invaluable to me from growing up in Machar and secular humanistic Judaism are just the foundation of set of values that I've had growing up in most every space that I've ever navigated from there on, whether it's Jewish spaces or non-Jewish spaces, social activist spaces. This foundation of a couple principles like Tikkun Ha'olam and others that I've always carried with me have been flagstaffs for how I navigate my moral compass in different situations. So that's definitely been a very significant part of growing up in the movement.
And yeah, I would echo that the social justice emphasis in humanistic Jewish contexts is a thing that's been really powerful and important to me, and a thing that has guided me in a lot of different work that I've done and experiences that I've had. I think also, the experience of having been able to grow up connecting with Jewish culture, music, art, food, language, ritual in a way that felt meaningful and resonant for me. Even though I didn't believe in God, I might not, connect with my Jewishness in a more traditional way, but there was this way that I could do it, and that I felt fully affirmed as a Jewish person, not outside of that, fully a part of it.
Yeah, and I think for me, obviously I've taken away a lot of the same values, but the benefits were really twofold in sort of the experiences that I took away. And one was the connections that I've made. This is my time where I promote Conclave, the youth conference. It's incredible, and I have connections across the country. As was mentioned, I'm from Seattle, and I have made lifelong friends in DC, in New York, in Michigan, and that's something that will stay with me and allows us to continue creating good organizations. And I think the other thing is the leadership. I've been on the board for 5-6 years now, and I've been learning from a lot of people that are really incredible and have set me up to learn well, as well as learning from my peers who may not be in an official leadership position, but know what they're doing and understand how the future is going to look and how to make that look what they want it to be.
As I spoke about yesterday, the consistency in values at home, in abroad, in the synagogue, and in the science class, that was all very important to me as well. The other thing that I found as a positive experience was that I came in with high expectations. I expected the services to be relevant and interesting. I expected the sermons to be intellectually stimulating and not boring. I expected the music to be beautiful. I didn't come in, as some people do to their synagogue experience, looking to be bored or expecting or fearing that it's just going to be irrelevant or the rabbi's going to drone on about something that I don't care about. And that was never the case. And I felt that creativity, that relevance, that interest, that enthusiasm, and that high quality was a really useful asset to have. If you have high expectations, then you're going to seek that out later on in life. I'm curious if maybe you have a memory of an episode or an experience or a holiday or something that you remember growing up celebrating that was particularly resonant for you. I sometimes will ask my Sunday school classes today, what's your favorite Jewish holiday that isn't Hanukkah? Because if you don't put that caveat in, they'll all say Hanukkah. So maybe a holiday memory or a memory with your community that really stuck with you as a positive experience.
I'm so glad that you asked this question. Now I'm like, I'm Kira.
Where are you from?
And I'm from Silver Spring, Maryland. I went to Mahar in the Washington, D.C. congregation, but now I'm living through waves of nostalgia. One of the best holidays that I feel like I've experienced was our congregation celebration of Purim, when we would have costume contests and Hamantaschen contests as well, just like all getting around the community center. I must have been maybe like 8. My like stark memory of dressing up as Esther with my tall paper crown, and it was just wonderful to be there with the whole community. And I've been able to sort of reconnect years later to celebrating other holidays outside of Hanukkah, such as Purim, and was involved in a Purim spiel that Detroit Jews for Justice / Tehillah congregation put on in the Detroit area where I live now. And it just felt wonderful to reconnect to that and those early experiences.
And I think for me, a memory that really stands out is High Holidays services. And I know in terms of our movement, we have a whole spectrum of people in terms of how they relate to ritual. For some people, that's very important. For some people, not so important. And I guess I'm more on the yay ritual end of things. And I have memories of High Holidays services, Kol Nidre services in particular, being just powerful and moving. And I remember, speaking these, affirmations, commitment to, transforming myself, to becoming, a better person, committing myself to doing positive things in the world, making change, listening to, my mom is a cellist, and she would typically play the Kol Nidre, the classical composition version of it for us for our services, and listening to my mom play, singing with everyone, talking with the community afterward, and just this feeling of coming together in a beautiful way as a community, committing ourselves to transformation and growth.
Also, I know there was a request for knowing who Kira was, so in case you don't know me, my name is Libby. As mentioned before, I'm from Seattle. I think for me, probably the most meaningful holiday, or the holiday that I really enjoyed the most, was definitely Rosh Hashanah. I never ended up going to Kol Nidre. I still need to do that. It's going to happen someday, I promise. But being able to connect with ritual and finding liturgy that expressed what I was looking for I love the Seattle group. However, there isn't a whole lot of ritual, and that is the one place where I found it. And having that space every year to come back and recommit and think about what I wanted in my life and where I wanted my next year to take me, and taking it 1 year at a time, was really incredibly valuable. And again, having the rituals and the liturgy to go with that was crucial.
I find it interesting that all of you chose holiday memories that were with the community. And when I think of holiday memories that are meaningful, for me, a lot of them are at home. We did holidays in the congregation as well. Maybe part of that is papered over for me for my professional experience, because after a while, Shabbats and high holidays and Rosh Hashanahs have become professional things for me, which have their own satisfactions too, but not the same as being an ordinary person participating. But doing Passover Seders at home that were cut and paste jobs with the messaging that we wanted to include, and that sang the songs that we remembered in our family that may have been unique to us and not sung in other Seders. Those kind of personalized memories really resonated for me, and I liked that I was in a movement that had that space, that created a way for people to make it relevant and meaningful for them as individuals. So now let's look at the flip side. What were some of the downsides you experienced growing up in Humanistic Judaism? Some of the challenges you ran into, or some of the places where you felt there's something missing here, or it's not exactly what it should be. You can go the opposite direction, maybe.
Oh boy, we're going the opposite direction, crazy. So I think for me, I just mentioned that the Seattle community doesn't have a whole lot of ritual, and for me that was actually honestly a downside. And I felt not necessarily ill-prepared to go into the world, but I felt like there was a bit of a separation between me and other Jews, because they would have traditional songs, and even though it didn't mean the same thing to me, I didn't necessarily have something to go alongside it. And there are a lot of cases where I did, but the cases where I didn't, I felt it. And it wasn't just because I wanted to feel like I belonged, but because to me there is something inherently valuable in having those traditions that are kept going, as I think is true with a lot of you. And to have that missing was really sad for me. And I think the other thing which goes lockstep with that is not having the ability to play with scripture and to play with liturgy. And I think, again, that is something that is especially true of Seattle, and I don't know necessarily where else that would be the case. But for me, my first chance to do that, I went to a traditionally, I believe it was like a Reform Jewish camp in the Oregon coast. And we had one chance to do a Shabbat service where my friend and I, who were both from SJC, went off and looked at their traditional service and just went through piece by piece. We're like, how would I replace God in this instance? And that was incredibly valuable. And we didn't have the books at SJC to go through and personally say, how would I replace this? So getting the chance to, even though I fully believe what I'm saying, having the chance to go through and do it for myself was something that I wish I had more of as a child.
I'll add to that. One of the challenges we have in our communities is we create it ourselves, except we have a committee that does it. And then if you're not on that committee, you're not part of the process. And for children growing up in the community, it's just something your parents have told you to read. And it might have been written 100 years ago, might have been written 20 years ago. It doesn't matter to them. I had this experience where a member of my community went to New York, had moved for a job from Chicago, and she came back and said, well, I went to their services, but they didn't do it exactly the way we do it here. I said, then you've missed the point. Part of the point is to be flexible and creative and do things differently. So maybe we need to train you in how to be flexible and how to do it yourself, and not just, here's a new version, now memorize this, and do it the same way.
And I'll also restate my name. I'm Eva Cohen from Minneapolis, from the Oramet congregation. And I think for me, I felt certain lacks or gaps in terms of the Jewish education that I received in my congregation. I think there was a lot of value, a lot of really caring and smart people who taught me, and clearly positive values that I drew from it that informed my choice to pursue, study in terms of humanistic rabbinate. I wouldn't be here if there hadn't been some good stuff. But I think, I guess one aspect of it just being the structure of the education program. My congregation has a children's school that meets on a monthly basis. And there's pros to that, I think, for a lot of families including my own, that made it feel accessible. It's not so hard to go to something once a month. You know, every week might be harder, twice a week is even harder than that. But just there are serious limitations in terms of how much you can do once a month, how much content you can cover, how much you can teach. And I think I felt, you know, even as a kid, a sense that there was sort of a lack of depth and also a lack of breadth. And then in terms of, you know, how that informed my interaction with other folks outside my community in the Jewish world and in other spaces. I don't want to touch too much on the next question coming up, but I think sometimes I felt like a little bit, I don't know, Jewishly illiterate, or I mean literally illiterate in the sense of like my Hebrew skills, which I've developed as an adult, but as a kid I had very little Hebrew instruction, and a lot of times I felt frustrated, like I couldn't participate, I couldn't hang because I didn't have the skill that I would need to be part of these other communities and conversations.
I really appreciate what both of you said. I echo a lot of those sentiments. And yeah, specifically, I think a big point for me was that I didn't realize how spiritual I really felt until maybe college or so, and that I wasn't really raised to have that as an option. Not that it was closed off, like you're not allowed to practice traditional ritual, but it wasn't something that I was well read in at all. So I sort of felt like I had to start from scratch in some ways, to be picking up pieces and catching up with my Jewish peers who, for a long time, I always felt I had to give a disclaimer about what sect of Judaism that I came from that they'd probably never heard of, and I'd have to give a little brief explanation. Whereas now I feel very proud to be representing this community, but there are definitely some gaps in the educational knowledge as well as sort of Jewish ritual and tradition that I feel like I wish I'd just known a little bit more about.
I just wanted to say, so you all get called upon to do the elevator speech. We do too, and we did as kids.
I'm also jumping in because that seems to be a trend now. I think for me, sort of what I was saying with ritual also relates to what you were saying about having a spiritual side. It took me going to that Jewish camp to realize that I could figure out what I wanted in terms of my spiritual side. So I didn't fast on Yom Kippur until I went to that camp, and then I realized that was something that I could reclaim for myself. So I think, again, having some sort of spiritual literacy for these kids, because you can be spiritual and be humanistic. It just depends on how you learn to do that. So making sure that you have the tools to give children spirituality if that's what they're looking for.
You know, now that I'm on the other side of the coin, I'm now teaching Sunday school and running Sunday schools instead of participating in them as a student. I appreciate the dilemma of you have how many hours in a Sunday, and what balance do you want to spend on what we do as opposed to what we don't do, and how much do you want to spend talking about things that aren't part of our ideology. And one of the weaknesses sometimes in liberal religious education is they spend all this time on kashrut and kosher laws when very few people in the congregation actually keep kosher, so the kids get the sense of themselves as not doing it right or not doing it fully. So I appreciate the choice made early in our movement to try and say, this is who we are, we're not going to apologize, and we're going to positively present what we do and not present what we don't do. The flip side is what you've been talking about, this lack of, you know, religious literacy. Even if it's not performance, it's knowing what it is. And so when I've started teaching, I've included more of that material in what we do, so they should know what a talis is. They should know what some of these texts are. They don't have to memorize them. They don't have to be able to recite them. We also emphasize to have a bar or bat mitzvah in our community, you have to learn Hebrew. Before it was optional. And I said, you know, I really feel like this is based, as you said, feeling illiterate in another community. You shouldn't walk into a synagogue and say, what are those symbols on the wall? You should know that those are yours. You know, whether you're learning Yiddish or Ladino, it's all the same alphabet, but there's a basic literacy to knowing those symbols, and that's cultural resonance too. If you're doing art, you can use the letters. There's all kinds of ways that they're relevant. One of the other weaknesses I found was an attitude. It was very patronizing toward religiosity. Religion was a crutch, the people who needed it were weak, and it was a deficient approach, and we were the best, and we were the right ones, and I always felt a little odd experiencing that, especially as I got older and began to pay attention, and I realized that there are smart, wonderful, nice people out there who are also religious. Not to mention that we're not the majority as I thought we were. So that changes your attitude a bit, and I think that we're doing better at that now, I would think. But that's something else to keep an eye on. And the last piece was, in particular at the Birmingham Temple, our celebrations were meaningful and interesting and relevant. They were very formal. It was a very rigid formula of reading song, reading song, reading song, sermon, final song. The songs were largely performative. There were a few sing-along songs, but mostly performative. It was always very formally done, no guitar, no sing-along, circle kind of thing. That evolved over time, and that has evolved in many communities. But I think, as we talked about earlier, the idea of being flexible with the celebrations, the format, the flow, the dynamic between audience and participation to make it a congregation and not an audience who's just auditing what's going on, I think that that's really important. Any other thoughts on how some of those issues that you felt were problematic might have been addressed or you might want to address going forward?
I could speak to that one a little bit. So it's interesting, I guess, kind of similar to you, Adam. I've had the opportunity to work now as a professional, as an adult in the congregation that I grew up in, and it's now, I think, been about 10 years that I've been teaching in our cultural school, and I spent 5 years as the school director. And so, over the time that I've been a teacher and in the time that I acted as school director, I tried to be really thoughtful about, what were the things that I felt like were maybe missing or lacking when I was growing up, and how could I bring those things to young people going through the school now that I was in charge. And I know it's kind of the classic thing where I'm sure there were, there's things that now I'm missing, and the next generation coming up is going to say, oh, why didn't they do this? And that's normal and that's natural. But I hope that at least in terms of some of the gaps or the issues that I saw, I've been able to address or to fill those. Like in terms of Hebrew, for instance, I've tried to reinforce a little bit more, consistent work with the language. Kids learn the Aleph Bet. We're working with it in kind of a regular way at all levels in the school in a way that I don't think was the case when I was younger. And I think that has clear positive value.
Yeah, I think also some of the stuff that I was talking about earlier, honestly, in my opinion, has pretty clear answers, which is bringing either, traditional liturgy into the classroom for deconstruction, or, creating a list of spiritual sources that, students can use, but finding where your resources are and making sure that you're utilizing a full range of resources and not the ones that have been specifically promoted to secular humanistic Jews, because I think that is very limiting. Even though we have a great spectrum of stuff out there, there's so much more that can be made spiritual or made secular if you want to.
I'll add sort of a separate point. Libby mentioned that she did conclave, and I think we were in the same cohort 1 year. But so that was the teenage experience sort of after you graduate from Sunday school, which was a lot of fun during the years that I did it. And I actually reconnected with a friend from one of those just this past year after maybe like a 6 or 7 year gap of like not seeing this person. And we ended up talking about that gap between there, like what could have been filled during that time to keep us connected to each other and connected to the movement in a way that it didn't feel like this precious time from our childhood and early life experiences, but it was something that we could still pull from in our more recent past and still be growing with, so that it felt very relevant to us. So that's not exactly advice with like a specific trajectory, but just another thing that I've thought about before.
When I was a teen in college, I found that the weekend experience, retreat, conference, conclave, was a very valuable one. I went both to Society for Humanistic Judaism weekends and also the Congress of Secular Jewish Organizations, allowed SHJ people to attend their teen conferences for some years when SHJ wasn't running them. There were a couple years of joint conferences. I made a lot of good friends out of that experience, and some of them have stayed connected, some on Facebook and some more closely. And what I felt most meaningful about those experiences was when you're growing up as the only humanistic Jewish community in your town, sometimes you feel like you're the weirdos. You're out there in a bubble, you're doing your thing, and nobody knows what you're talking about half the time. It was a little easier in Detroit because we had a building and we had a 50-year history, and people had come to bar mitzvahs here, and they knew what it was like, more or less, or at least they knew a surface version of it. But when you went to these conclaves and these weekends, you met other people like you from all over the country. And also they tended to be, not always, but they tended to be nice and inclusive and welcoming. And so that made a nice community feeling out of it as well. So the feeling like you're not in a bubble and you're not all alone was really valuable.
Yeah, to that point, I want to share a story because I have the time. So I've been planning Conclave for 6 years since I've been on the board. And I was very happy because this year we had a student from Seattle who was the only Jewish girl in her class. Even though she was part of SJC, she didn't feel like she had a Jewish community and was looking elsewhere, and I convinced her to come to Conclave. She found her people. She's now on the board. So you can get kids involved.
And it might not be a bad idea to think about it even in your local communities. If you have a liturgy committee that evaluates what's done at the services, see if you have high school students who might be interested in getting involved in some way, either in the text question or the design question or some other way. If you have a board of governors or you have even a volunteer board, see if you can get a youth representative on that. 20 years ago, I interviewed for a rabbinic job in Chicago. I was very impressed that the interview committee had 2 of the students in the school participating on the interview process for the rabbi. I thought that was a really smart idea. And I think the more we can involve people, again, as owners, as participants, as co-creators in what's happening in the community, the more investment they'll have. But I think also the better quality things will be produced. I think they say for national organizations, you should have 30% of your board under 30 years old. That's for a national organization, but my guess is locally, it's not a bad idea too, to think about something like that, because think of the ideas, the energy, the new perspectives that audience will bring to it.
Can I add? I love adding things. I think also on that point, it's really important to get youth involved early, because that's how you get them to stick around. If they're invested from day one, they're going to continue being invested. The reason I'm still here is because I'm on the board and I care what's happening in the board, because I've been planning youth things and I've been engaged in hiring processes for SHJ, and it makes me want to stay involved. So if you get them involved even at the local level, they will engage.
So you ultimately left our bubble. You went out there into the wider world. And there are other communities out there. There's a general American religious world. Again, it sometimes is a revelation to realize there's many more religious people out there than non-religious coming from our communities. There's the general Jewish world. There's the general humanist and secular world. And I'm curious for your experiences encountering those other worlds and how you found your humanistic Jewish background either prepared you or had some bumps for you as you went out there.
As I mentioned before, I, in a lot of these situations, felt like I gave a little disclaimer about where I came from, just assuming people would not know what secular humanism was. And when I went to school, I went to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. I actually joined an a cappella. Yeah. I joined a Jewish a cappella group my freshman year, which was a great experience, but a lot of new firsts for me of learning about certain Jewish rituals and practices that had been maybe vaguely familiar to me, but I hadn't seen them in practice. I didn't really know what they were about. I definitely hadn't seen my peers, let alone other Jews, being so deeply connected to these rituals. And it really opened my eyes to what some of these traditions were there for, but also how people were still connecting to them today in a different way than I had been hearing about them growing up in the movement. So that is one point, but then in other spheres that I've been a part of, sort of in Jewish organizing circles, from Israel-Palestine work to local American Jewish involvement in community organizing, those have been areas that I felt more literate, I can say, because those values of being from the community and knowing what I stand for and what principles I believe in have helped guide me in being able to get to the point and get to the work that we want to be doing together in ways that I don't want to say other sects of Judaism didn't prepare certain individuals for, but it didn't feel quite as clouded as being clearly there for this purpose.
I guess I'm thinking about a couple of specific kinds of ways that I think my humanistic Jewish identity and experiences have positively informed my encounters with the world outside the bubble. So in terms of experiences with the broader Jewish community, I spent a couple of years teaching part-time in like an afternoon Hebrew school in a more traditional kind of Jewish context, like in sort of theory, like a pluralistic, in practice, most of the kids coming from conservative Jewish households, and teaching with those kids, teaching sort of traditional Bible content, things like that. I had the experience of not an insignificant number of students, saying things to me like, well, I'm an atheist, or, I don't believe in that, that's not true. I think a little bit of a like, oh, I'm going to push her buttons, see how far we can go here, and like, maybe surprising to them, that wasn't so concerning to me. And I think in that space, I was, and I was conscious of my role there. It was not a humanistic Jewish context or space, even though the people who hired me, understood my ideology and my orientation. But I felt like I was able to say to my students, that's okay, and you don't have to believe in God to be Jewish. You can still read these stories and learn about these traditions and recognize what's interesting about them, what's important, what are positive values we can take from these things, how does this tradition connect you to your family, to your history, and I could make a case to them for why these things could still be meaningful, and that wasn't contingent on their believing in God or a particular way of being Jewish. And then I think in terms of interactions with the broader world outside the Jewish world, I guess like maybe a not insignificant number of humanistic rabbis, like a not insignificant number of people who graduated from college in 2009. I've had kind of a professionally eclectic trajectory. I've done a lot of different kinds of work. In education, I've done work as an artist, things related to medical acting and training, and in different spheres where I've worked with all different kinds of people. Also talking about who I am, what I do. Oh yes, I'm humanistic Jewish. I also teach in this context. I'm interested in maybe becoming a rabbi in that movement. And then of course, people asking me questions about that. Wait, so humanistic Judaism, what does that mean? Oh wait, okay, so you don't believe in God, but being Jewish is still important to you. Okay, human power and possibility. Okay, so people connecting those dots, and I've been able to, I think, represent to a broader sphere of people that there are diverse ways of being Jewish. There's not just one kind of unitary Judaism, which is what I think a lot of people who aren't in touch with the broader Jewish world may think before they meet someone like all of us.
Yeah, so I think for me, there are two things that sort of categorize my experiences with the outside Jewish world. And they could be split into two different categories. One would be Jewish camp and Hillel, and the other one would be, distrust and interest. And so for me, Jewish camp was definitely a learning experience. As I mentioned, I got a lot of my spirituality from that, even if it was secular. But it also meant the only reason that I had the opportunity to look at that liturgy on my own during that Shabbat service was because a rabbi's son had asked. And he was a traditional Jew and said, I think I'll learn better if I do this on my own, and brought me and my friend. We had been asking for weeks and they didn't let us. So there's definitely a separation between understanding that we are also Jewish and the way that we engage with Judaism is equally as important as a rabbi's son, for example. And I also felt that to a certain extent when I got to Hillel. I met with the Hillel's director, and she kind of tried to convince me that I believed in God. She was like, but don't you see a light in people? And I'm like, we don't need to talk about this.
Well, we talk about a light all the time, but we don't mean it anything more than a light. Sometimes a light is just a light.
Yeah, she was like, it connects people. I'm like, we can deal with that later. But once I connected with Hillel more, what I found is that there was actually a lot of people that were interested in what we were doing. My first Passover there, I was walking to the Seder with someone that I like vaguely knew, and I was like, so like, what do you do for Passover? And they were like, well, you know, this is my first traditional Seder. I do this weird thing that I found online called secular humanistic Judaism. We have a secular humanistic Seder. I was like, oh, I could tell you more about that. But since then, I've been able to lead multiple secular humanistic Shabbats in that Hillel. And yeah, so it depends on the Hillel, and not every Hillel is that accepting, not every Hillel is that excited about what we're doing. But I'm really excited. I'm bringing them back one of the liturgy books, and I seriously think that in the future we can continue to bring that in, and that's been something that's really important to me. And the second time I led that Seder was actually brought up to me by someone else who had learned about secularism from their studies in Israel, and was like, I don't believe this, but this is really cool, let's do it. And that was also met with someone coming in and saying, I don't understand why we're doing this. I feel like you are making me step away from my traditional Shabbat and I won't get as much out of this. I'm really offended that we're doing this. But that was one person out of 20 people. And usually there are like 8 to 12 people that show up to those Shabbats. We had 20. So I think there's definitely an interest, especially on college campuses, if you can figure out how to tap it.
One of the revelations for me was that there were so many secularized Jews out there who had actually never heard of us. And you know, maybe that was a function of the pre-internet days, but maybe it's also a function of just not looking or not using the right keywords or whatever. Or maybe we're not framing it the right way for them to find us. I would go out and meet Jewish Unitarians and people involved in the American Humanist Association of Jewish background. I remember I was talking with one of their associates and I said, well, you know, she was of a Jewish background herself, one of her parents was Jewish. I said, well, you know, there's a humanistic Jewish congregation in the DC area. She said, really? As if it was out of nowhere. So I think that we're not the only people that live in bubbles. You know, there are other movements, secular movements, experiences that have their own bubbles, and part of our goal is to break that down and to find those commonalities. I love those experiences like Libby described, where someone says to me, you know, you should really think about humanistic Judaism. And that was amusing. It happened recently on Facebook where I made some sarcastic comment about a survey in Canada that said there's large numbers of secular Jews. I said, I'm shocked to hear this. And someone said, you know, you should really read more about secular humanistic Judaism and find out. I said, here's my bio. So I want to make sure we have time for questions and answers from the audience, but I wanted to ask a last question to our panel, and that is, looking forward, what are some of the most important pieces of your humanistic Jewish inheritance that you would want to carry forward? Whether it's in choosing to have a family of your own or just in your own personal life, what are the pieces that you want to put in your backpack to carry with you going forward?
Yeah, sure. I think for me, something that's been important and is actually based on a very specific experience is something that I did during my bat mitzvah, which is during my bat mitzvah, we had to write identity speeches in which we situated ourselves in the Jewish community and said, this is what I believe, this is how I fit in, this is how I want to keep doing it. And I found myself continuing to write those essays throughout my life unprompted. And I think having that ability, you could do that at Rosh Hashanah, you know, but having that ability to say, I know where I stand, I know where I want to be, this is how I want to engage, this is how I'm going to do it, is really crucial and really brought me through Judaism to the point where I am today, and continues to make me, you know, want to reconsider where I am in the movement and, you know, how I keep engaging. So.
And I think for me, I guess I feel kind of mission driven about this. I really feel that it's important that humanistic Judaism exists as an option for people of all ages, but I'll say especially for children and for families. Because I think there's a lot of people, and my family is, you know, one of those families where for whom, if there hadn't been a humanistic Jewish, you know, congregation or group or chavurah or whatever, we wouldn't have had any real Jewish community, education, you know, participation in things beyond our immediate family. And I think that would have been a really serious loss for us. And I think of a lot of the youth and the families I've now had the chance to work with over the years in our movement who have said similar things, like, oh, you know, I wanted there to be something like this, and if there wasn't, I don't know what we would do. And I think to feel that we can offer Jewish community and meaning for youth and for families who, you know, feel about Jewishness as we do. And I think also, and this is something that's been touched on in other programs this weekend, but thinking about like interfaith and intercultural families, which, you know, other movements, other branches of Judaism are starting to do a better job of thinking about inclusion and respect, but I don't think they're necessarily there yet. And I think, you know, we always have been there, like 100% affirming of all families, of all people. You know, if you identify with the history, the culture, the future of the Jewish people, you want to be there, you're in 100%, and I think that's huge. And I think also in terms of, you know, affirming and celebrating LGBTQ people, which is, again, I think a thing that other Jewish denominations are doing a better job of doing, but I think we've done a really good job of, you know, for a long time and continue to do. Like I think about some young people in my congregation who I teach, who identify as queer, a student who came out as non-binary, I think for the first time to anyone in the context of our classroom, and they said, you know, I prefer for you to use they, them pronouns to refer to me. And, you know, afterward, like they took like a deep breath, like, oh, I can't believe I said that, but I feel so glad that I was able to share that with you here. And so feeling like we're creating a space where young people and people of all ages who have all different kinds of identities can be 100% affirmed in who they are as Jewish people, as humans, and that's powerful and that's important.
Yes, I absolutely agree with a lot of what you said. Specifically, our work with interfaith communities, I've been very drawn to interfaith work, and I'm not sure what roots to attribute it to, whether it's from being raised in secular humanism, and our inclusivity and acceptance of many different identities. That's something that I'm very passionate about, and I hope to see more of in the future of our movement. And another, it's kind of a large point, I guess, but being represented in the sort of intersection of Jewish engagement with social justice issues on much more public platforms, where events such as the Women's March or other events that have been happening more recently and having some small Jewish representation, that has been sort of an important light for me to see that there, but then nothing from secular humanism where I feel like it's so directly connected to all of the values and roots that I learned about. It seems like kind of a no-brainer to introduce that we've been here all along and we believe all of these things that can be pushing us towards a more inclusive, progressive society, and just being able to sort of expand our knowledge and our reach to individuals who aren't touched, just don't know that we exist yet in those ways that we've been talking about, and continuing to connect people between different identifications and different denominations as well.
We actually have a session, the very next block, on living our humanistic Jewish social justice values. So it's a topic that's oak around in what's happening in the movement today. Well, we have a few minutes for audience questions.
Wow, that worked well. One of the initiatives we're working with in SHJ is trying to provide long-distance bar bat mitzvah to anybody, anywhere, if we can connect with them. So we're trying to think about how we articulate what every community says. Oh my God, our private bat mitzvahs are so great. So I'm curious about whether, or what aspects of your bat mitzvahs were important to you, or you would say, if I was going to tell somebody, oh yeah, your 11-year-old would really like to do this, what are you taking away from it that you think was particularly good?
I guess a couple aspects. I had a b'nai mitzvah with 3 other people, which was a really interesting aspect that I really enjoyed, being able to work with others and sharing with my peers, us all going, this microphone might die in a second, sharing our experiences through preparing for our bar and bat mitzvahs together, which was really exciting and also very comforting to have others around, which I'm not sure if that's done in other sects of Judaism, but definitely was something that I attributed to Mahar and secular humanism. And then the other was just being so open to whatever we wanted to do. I did like a one-woman play about endangered species connected to Noah's Ark and Tikkun HaOlam, and I made masks and I like sang and danced and did a whole skit and everything, and that just would not have been possible in any other scenario. So I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity to do that, but also thinking back on how formative that was for sort of blending my creative passions with my passions for social justice issues, environmental issues, values that were rooted in me from secular humanism, and sharing that with lots of people who seem to enjoy it as well.
And it's interesting, even though I grew up in the humanistic Jewish movement, I didn't have a bat mitzvah. And I think I can actually tell you why, and some things that may be helpful to think about, especially as you're thinking about reaching young people remotely. At the time that I would have been preparing for bat mitzvah, I really didn't have a cohort. There was like maybe one other student my age, and his family was kind of becoming less involved. He decided he wasn't going to have a bar mitzvah. And so had it been a thing that I was going to do, it would have been just me. And at the time also, there really hadn't been any young people in the congregation for a long time. I was kind of part of the first wave of folks entering. So I'd never been to, a humanistic b'nai mitzvah before. I'd been to, services of cousins who were more religious. But like, I didn't have any kind of model or visual. And I think, and I was a kid who was pretty serious about my homework, and I'm like, well, I have a lot of work to do, and now you want me to do this other thing, and I don't really know what it is. I've never seen it before. And so I think, if you were to offer an experience like this to young people who are, living lots of different places and maybe in places where they don't have a humanistic Jewish community, I think if you can offer them really clear sort of visuals, video even, if you can share with people recordings of services like this so they can see, okay, this is what it looks like. I have a clear sense of all the different kinds of things that I could do. And then if you can somehow digitally offer them some sort of a cohort experience, and I'm thinking about our social media religion here, but which we good to be critical about, but thinking about platforms, ways that people could be connected into different kinds of digital groups where they could have conversations, maybe monthly video chats, things like that, so that they could have a sense that they're part of a larger group doing this thing together.
Obviously, I got a lot out of my bat mitzvah, as I mentioned, the identity speech. I think there were 2 other things that really stood out to me as really crucial to that experience. The first one is the Remember Us project. I don't know if anyone else except for Seattle uses that, but it is a project which gives you the name of a child that died in the Holocaust, and you share your bar bat mitzvah with them. And I still light a yard site candle for Leah Krutzel every year on my bat mitzvah anniversary. So I think that's really important and really tied me to my history. And the other thing that I did was a service project, which is part of what the SJC curriculum required, at least at my time. I don't know what they do now. And I feel like it really set me up for leadership in the future. I planned a Seder for Tu B'Shvat, set up the community service organizing, et cetera, et cetera. And that really made me engage with my Jewishness, but it also made me engage with the community. It made me consider what I wanted to do to engage with the community, and led me to, now I'm a Girl Scout Gold Award earner because I had the background in how to set up a project and how to follow through with it. So learning those skills is also, I think, important. It's one way to do a bat mitzvah, but I think having that opportunity is great.
Thank you. Really helpful.
Thank you. You are so inspiring, all of you. I'm very I'm a little verklempt after here. I got a sense from all of you about like some lack of ritual, especially from you, and I'd like to hear specifically what ritual, because that's something I'm really interested in developing in our communities.
Sure. Well, I'll speak a little bit from my experiences, really in like the past year or two, being connected to some local Jewish congregations. I've mentioned Congregation Tehillah and Detroit Jews for Justice that are in Detroit, where I am now. Those, as well as a youth organization called If Not Now that some might be familiar with, that really sort of center Jewish ritual in the other practices that they're trying to do in the congregations. For the congregation's case, that's of course their regular Jewish practice and the way that they do general services. But for If Not Now, it centers Jewish ritual in our building of a different vision of Jewish community in order to stand up for the dignity and life of all Israelis, Palestinians, Americans, everybody in the world, but also keeping a sustainable Jewish community that we really feel connected to and can reclaim in a way. And that's included everything from Havdalah services. I went to one last night. I had not heard about Havdalah. I realized like this time last year. So it's been sort of a quick turnaround of learning about a lot of Jewish rituals, and in sort of more specifically like what happens during those services and what the Hebrew actually means, and trying to learn a little bit more about all of the symbolic pieces that we have as a part of the rituals as well, the spices, the wine, the bread, what it all stands for in a way that feels a little bit more contemporary and relevant to our being able to connect with it in our age now, as well as in interfaith conversations or whoever else might be able to learn about it with us, if that makes some sense.
Any other questions?
I sense from your comments one of the, I guess, criticisms was a certain lack of knowledge about traditional Judaism in your education, and I'm wondering if any of you have had the experience of being questioned by a non-Jewish friend or acquaintance as to explain something and having difficulty doing that. I'm thinking of my own experience where I had a friend who saw a film that had to do with very Orthodox Jews, and he asked me, he said, what are those straps they're winding around their hands and arms? You know, what is that about? And I'm wondering if you've had that same kind of experience.
So for me, the answer is definitely yes. However, it wasn't necessarily from a friend perspective. I went to an elementary school with a lot of evangelical Christians, and a lot of the education and the way that I learned about Judaism was by learning things to defend myself against their verbal attacks. And so there definitely is that question, but I think for me, it's always just been a catalyst for more learning, even though I didn't necessarily get that from my Sunday schools. I was like, I'm gonna learn facts so I can fight people. So the answer is yes, there is interest, but it definitely was more of a self-learning issue than it was something that I was able to get elsewhere, which would have been nice just to have.
I actually have done a workshop at teen conferences and also something we do with the 7th grade mitzvah class that I teach in my congregation. I call it Humanistic Jewish Self-Defense. And it's not about, you know, military response, but it's how to respond to the kind of common questions that we get. I think it's useful for kids going through the bar mitzvah cycle to have some vocabulary, some ways to respond that feel honest to them. And you don't get into a Bible quoting contest because you're going to lose that, you know. But you find a way that you're on comfortable ground and where you could find out more information, and that it's okay to say, I don't know, and I'll find out more. All kinds of skills and self-confidence that they can have. This is, I think, one of the things that's most inspiring about our educational programs is that there are deficiencies and there's always limits to what you can do. But I think most of our students come out with a strong sense of who they are as individuals, a sense of their values, their family's values, and a sense that who they are is an integrated person. And there isn't sort of a split personality when they're Jewish versus when they're out there in the street. And that gives you a sense of self-confidence and esteem, and I think that's a valuable asset that we provide to them going out into the world. We have, let's see, we have time for maybe one more question.
How about we do 2 questions at the same time to really make it like a bonus challenge?
Okay.
Absolutely inspiring. SHJ leadership needs to know what kinds of messaging most effectively reaches young people. So I want to thank you for volunteering to be the center of the task force that's going to pursue that.
I grew up here. I started when I was 8 years old, so I could really relate to all 3 of your comments because, you know what, it hasn't changed much. It took me a long time to learn the ritual. As a matter of fact, my kids went to school here, but then my wife, who grew up in a much more traditional place, wanted to change. And I really learned a lot from belonging to another synagogue, although I always belonged here. But So I really could relate to what you guys said. It hasn't changed. I can tell you a disappointing thing for as a member of the Birmingham Temple is doing a terrible job of recruiting my generation. I mean, Adam will tell you, there's very few people that started here. They still live in this town, a lot of them. And they still like the Birmingham Temple, but for whatever, whether it be their spouse or just them. But my question to you is, because I didn't go through this, because I grew up with the man, so what did they teach you about Rabbi Wein? Because I can tell you, I wouldn't be who I was without him.
So I had a very privileged experience growing up because my mother was one of the founders of the Seattle organization. And so she had a lot of personal experiences with him. And as I was growing up, I got a lot of personal stories about how he touched the movement. And I don't think it was ever necessarily taught in the classes. We knew that Wein was the one that sort of got things rolling and was really crucial to the movement. But I think that a lot of the personal aspects are missing. We did make a point of talking about him during conclave, I believe last year, to make sure that we knew where we came from and make sure that the kids were engaging with their roots. So I think that it is sort of, if that's something that people want to continue pursuing, I think it is important to know where we came from, and could be something incredibly worth mentioning in curriculum.
Yeah, and I think in terms of my knowledge of and experience with Sherwin Wein. So I'm going to be 32 next year, and I grew up in Minnesota, so not here in Detroit. But I did have the opportunity to hear him speak at least once that I remember as a kid. My family, brought me to a Friday night Shabbat service and program where he was talking. And I remember, being young, but finding that impactful and knowing, wow, this guy is important and he's the one who started this whole thing that I'm part of. In terms of learning a lot about his philosophy and his approach, I think it was touched on in my education formally in the context of the school, but was not super elaborated. I think it was something that I had more exposure to through our services and our ritual. We, for many years, were lucky to be led by a Madrich, Harold Launder, who trained with Sherwin Wein, and so, knew him personally and took a lot of value from what he learned from him. And our services, which, were written by Harold and other folks and committees who had, contacts with Sherwin Wine, a lot of our liturgy was, liturgy that he wrote. And so, maybe it wouldn't be spoken about in every moment, but as I'm reading through the service, I see, oh, okay, that was written by Dr. Sherwin Wine. So yeah, I think, having a sense of his values and his vision was a part of how I grew up.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, but I did not know Rabbi Sherwin Wine. I never met him. I knew of his name, and I knew that he was the founder of SHJ. And my closest connection to his impact was actually through the leader of our youth group after graduating from Sunday school, Becca. I don't remember her last name, but she worked under Sherwin Wine. So when she came back to DC from the Midwest, she brought sort of this kind of energy. She was pretty young, but she felt very passionate about what she had learned under Sherwin Wine. And I just remember at like age 13, that making a really big impression that this man was really important starting this movement. And I still have yet to learn more about him, but yeah.
Well, actually, we have free copies of a book about Sherwin on a table out there. You're welcome to take. Has a bio and essays about him, and also a wonderful essay by him at the end of the book. It's really a mature formulation of humanistic Judaism. If I point people to one thing to read of his, it's that last 30 pages of A Life of Courage. I think one of our challenges in humanistic Judaism, as we're looking forward to 50 years, is how to find the balance of looking back and looking forward. I'm really excited that the two panels I've been on have been on young rabbis yesterday, and young leadership looking forward who grew up in the movement. This is the future. It's not going to be one person. It's not going to be organized around one thinker. That might have been how we started. But we have to move beyond that phase, and we have. That's what makes it most exciting. Not that we've made it for 50 years, but that we have our roots in place to move forward to the next 50. Well, I want to thank our panelists for participating, and thank you all for being here.
Also, because I have you all in one room, I am trying to make sure that Conclave keeps happening, which means that I need the congregational buy-in, which means I need contact for your educational leaders or people that have access to your kids. So, if you know someone who is leading your educational program, please give us their information. You can come talk to me afterwards and I'll just take down their name and email. But we need to make sure we have those roots in place, so please keep working with us on that.